He had the wealth of a small country and the pedigree of a king, but Caleb Hayes couldn't see the gold he sat on. An accident took his sight, leaving him drowning in a world of fake smiles and synthetic scents. When high society paraded their most pedigreed Omegas before him, the blind Alpha didn't hesitate. He bypassed the silk and perfume, reaching out for the calloused hand of a nobody. The elite gasped, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know why. The grandfather clock in the drawing room ticked like a judge's gavel. Each heavy metallic clack echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Hayes estate. Caleb sat in the center of the room. He hated the leather chair beneath him. It was too soft, too yielding, designed to make a man feel entirely comfortable while he sold off his future. His hands rested on the silver pommel of his cane. He kept his posture rigid. If he slouched, even a fraction, the vultures circling him would smell weakness. He didn't need his eyes to know how many people were in the room. He could hear them. He could smell them. "Caleb, pay attention," Gideon snapped. His uncle's voice came from the left, near the fireplace. The crackle of burning birch wood didn't entirely mask the sound of Gideon ice clinking in a crystal tumbler. "This is Oliver of the Montgomery estate. He just finished his degree in art history." Caleb breathed in through his nose. Slowly. Oliver was standing about 6 feet away. The Omega's scent was overwhelming, a cloying cloud of engineered vanilla and crushed orchids. It was a synthetic pheromone enhancer, the kind high society Omegas bought for thousands of dollars an ounce to mask their natural biology. They all wanted to smell perfectly sweet, perfectly compliant. To Caleb's hyper-tuned senses, Oliver smelled like a chemical fire in a candy factory. Underneath the fake vanilla, Caleb caught the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. Oliver's heart was beating too fast, a rabbit in a snare. "Mr. Hayes," Oliver said. His voice was breathless, pitched artificially high. "It is an honor to meet you. I've read about your philanthropic work with the blind." "Stop!" Caleb's voice was a low rumble. He didn't raise it, but the sudden silence in the room was absolute. Oliver swallowed. Caleb heard the click of the Omega's throat. "You don't care about my philanthropy," Caleb said, turning his head slightly so his sightless gaze landed roughly where Oliver's chest would be. "You care about the fact that my grandfather's trust requires me to bond with an Omega before I turn 30, or I forfeit my voting shares in the company. You're terrified of me. You're terrified of the dark glasses I'm wearing. You think I'm an invalid, but your family needs the capital injection my marriage bond will provide." That isn't true, I assure you. Your heart rate is hovering around 110 beats per minute. You smell like panic and cheap starch, Caleb interrupted, his tone flat. "Go home, Oliver." "Caleb," Gideon hissed, the ice in his glass rattling violently. "That is enough. The Montgomery family is highly respected." "Then you marry him, Gideon. Next." A heavy sigh rippled through the room. There were 3 other Omegas waiting. Caleb knew this because he could categorize the nauseating cocktail of their perfumes. One smelled of forced eucalyptus and greed. Another smelled of heavy rosewater and boredom. It was a cattle market, a parade of pedigreed flesh dressed in bespoke suits, all vying for the title of the blind Alpha's caretaker. Before the accident, they wouldn't have dared look at him twice. Caleb used to be terrifying. He used to read balance sheets and tear apart boardrooms with a glare. Now, a shattered windshield and a severed optic nerve had reduced him to a pity project. They thought they could handle him. They thought because he lived in darkness, they could lead him by a leash. "Next is Preston," Gideon said, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Preston is a concert pianist." Preston stepped forward. The rustle of expensive silk, the click of Italian leather shoes. "Mr. Hayes," Preston said. Confident, smooth. Caleb opened his mouth to dismiss him, but a sudden harsh sound fractured the suffocating atmosphere of the room. Thud. It came from the far right corner of the drawing room, the library annex. Scrape. Someone had dragged a heavy wooden ladder across the floorboards. "Apologies," a voice muttered. It wasn't directed at Caleb. It wasn't directed at anyone. It was just a dry, irritated rasp of a man who had dropped something heavy. Caleb tilted his head. He inhaled. It cut through the vanilla. It cut through the rose water. Dust, old paper, the sharp, bitter sting of ozone before a rainstorm, layered over bruised mint. It was entirely natural. There were no chemical enhancers, no sweet undertones designed to appease an alpha. It was a raw, unbothered omega scent. And underneath it, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. Slow, calm. 60 beats a minute. Whoever was in the corner wasn't afraid. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just annoyed. "Who is that?" Caleb asked. Gideon scoffed. "Nobody. Just the archivist. Ignore him." Preston was speaking. "I asked who it is," Caleb repeated, his grip tightening on his cane. His alpha instincts, usually buried under layers of cynical control, flared abruptly. The mint and ozone scent was dragging him forward like a hook in the jaw. "His name is Rowan," Gideon said, the disdain practically dripping from his tongue. "He's cataloging the estate's historical documents. He was supposed to be out of the room an hour ago." "I was," Rowan's voice floated over from the annex. The tone was completely devoid of deference. "Until your butler locked the east doors to keep the suitors from wandering, I'm stuck here until you finish your... whatever this is." Preston cleared his throat loudly. "As I was saying, Mr. Hayes, I believe a partnership between us..." Caleb stood up. He didn't use the armrests. He pushed up with his legs, planting his cane firmly on the Persian rug. The room went dead silent again. The alpha presence he usually kept tightly coiled rolled out over the room in a heavy, suffocating wave. Oliver whimpered. Preston took a step back. But from the corner, the heartbeat remained steady. Caleb began to walk. He counted his steps. He always counted his steps. 3 paces forward to clear the coffee table. Turn 90 degrees to the right, 7 paces across the open rug. The floor transitioned from thick wool to polished hardwood. 2 more paces. "Caleb, what are you doing?" Gideon demanded. The sharp sound of a glass slamming down on a table. Footsteps hurrying after him. Caleb ignored him. He tracked the scent of bruised mint. It was stronger now, mixed with the smell of binding glue and old leather. He stopped when his cane brushed the edge of the wooden ladder. Rowan was still kneeling on the floor. He had dropped a stack of ledgers, and he was currently picking up the scattered pages. He didn't look up when the billionaire alpha towered over him. He just kept stacking the papers, his jaw set in a hard line. Rowan was exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, ink stains on his fingers, and a mountain of debt waiting for him back at a cramped apartment. He had no time for the theatrical games of the ultra-rich. "You're in my light," Rowan said flatly. Someone in the back of the room gasped. Omegas did not speak to alphas that way, certainly not an alpha of Caleb Hayes' standing. Caleb didn't move. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "I can't see the light." "Well, I can," Rowan replied, entirely unfazed. "And I need it to see the dates on these tax records from 1920, so if you wouldn't mind shifting your impressive presence about 2 feet to the left, I'd appreciate it." Caleb didn't step left. "You're an Omega." "Observant." Rowan grabbed the last ledger, dusting it off against his slacks. He finally stood up. He was shorter than Caleb by half a foot, but he didn't tilt his chin up in submission. He looked directly at the dark lenses of Caleb's glasses. "Are we stating obvious facts? You're wearing a terrible tie." Gideon arrived, grabbing Caleb's shoulder. "Caleb, stop making a scene. Let's return to the guests." Caleb violently shrugged off Gideon's hand. He leaned in slightly toward Rowan. The Omega didn't flinch. He didn't lean back. He held his ground. "Watch your cane," Rowan said calmly. "There's a loose floorboard right by your left heel. If you pivot too hard, you'll trip." Caleb froze. Since the accident, people treated him in one of 2 ways. They either grabbed him, manhandling him like a toddler to keep him safe, or they completely ignored his blindness until he walked into a wall, too terrified to speak up. Rowan did neither. He gave Caleb data. A warning. He left the choice of how to navigate it entirely up to Caleb. "What is your full name?" Caleb asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Rowan Finch." "Are you bonded?" Rowan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Do I look bonded? I work 60 hours a week in a dusty basement for a wage that barely covers my rent. I don't have time to play house." "You do now," Caleb said. He turned on his heel, carefully avoiding the loose board Rowan had mentioned. He faced the general direction of his uncle. "Gideon, tell the others to leave. Draw up the papers." "Papers?" Gideon sputtered, the anger finally breaking through his polished veneer. "For what?" "For him. I'm choosing him." The drawing room exploded into murmurs. Preston shouted something about an insult. Oliver began to cry. Gideon stepped directly in front of Caleb, his breathing ragged. "You are out of your mind," Gideon hissed, keeping his voice low enough that only Caleb and Rowan could hear. "He is staff. He has no breeding, no status, no money. He is a nobody." "He doesn't smell like a chemical spill," Caleb countered, "and he doesn't treat me like a piece of broken glass. That makes him infinitely more valuable than anyone else you've dragged into my house." Rowan, who had been silently observing the chaos, finally spoke up. "Hold on. I think I missed a step here. Who said I was agreeing to anything?" Caleb turned back to him. "You have a debt." Rowan stiffened. His scent spiked, a sudden flare of bitter ozone. "How do you know about that?" "I own the bank holding your brother's medical debt," Caleb lied smoothly. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew the scent of desperation, and he knew how his family operated. If Rowan worked for the estate and was broke, the Hayes family held the paper. "Marry me. 5 years. On paper. You get your own wing in the house, a black card, and the debt is erased tomorrow morning." Rowan stared at him. The alpha wasn't joking. His jaw was set, his broad shoulders braced as if preparing for a physical fight. Rowan looked past him to the wealthy, pedigreed Omegas staring at him with undisguised disgust. They hated him simply for existing in their space. Rowan did the math in his head. The debt was a crushing weight that was slowly drowning him. He was tired. He was so incredibly tired. 5 years, Rowan echoed, his voice devoid of any romantic illusion. "Not a day more," Caleb promised. "I don't wear collars," Rowan stated, his tone hard. "And I don't submit." Caleb's lips twitched. "I wouldn't ask you to. Do we have a deal?" Rowan looked at the hand Caleb held out. It was a large hand, scarred across the knuckles from the car crash that took his sight. Rowan reached out and gripped it. "Deal." Gideon swore loudly, storming out of the room. The suitors were hastily ushered out by the butler. Caleb and Rowan stood alone by the bookshelves, their hands still locked in a purely transactional grip. No sparks, no magic. Just two cynical men surviving the hand they were dealt. There was no wedding. 3 days later, a lawyer slid a heavy stack of contracts across a mahogany desk. Caleb signed where the lawyer guided his pen. Rowan signed where he was told. The ink dried, and Rowan Finch became Rowan Hayes, the legally bonded Omega of the Hayes Empire. Rowan packed his life into 2 duffel bags. He was moved from his cramped studio apartment into the east wing of the estate. The bedroom was the size of his entire old apartment, featuring a massive king-sized bed, heavy velvet curtains, and an ensuite bathroom lined with black marble. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. For the first week, Rowan barely saw his new husband. Caleb kept to his own strict schedule. He woke at 5 in the morning, exercised in his private gym, took meetings in his study via text-to-speech software, and ate his meals in silence. Rowan spent his days in the library, continuing his archival work as if nothing had changed. The staff treated him with a bizarre mix of extreme deference and thinly veiled contempt. He was the master of the house now, but they all knew he used to scrub dust off the floorboards. The friction between them began on the 8th day. Rowan was reading in the main sitting room. It was late, past midnight. A violent thunderstorm was rattling the tall windows of the estate, casting jagged flashes of lightning across the dark room. Rowan hated storms. They made him anxious, spiking his scent with that sharp, bitter ozone. The double doors opened. Caleb walked in. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a gray t-shirt, his hair damp from a shower. He moved with his usual measured precision, counting his steps, his cane sweeping lightly over the rug. Rowan held his breath, watching him. Caleb walked to the liquor cabinet. He found a glass by touch, poured 2 fingers of scotch, and turned around. He took 3 steps toward the leather sofa and stopped. "You're awake," Caleb said to the empty room. Rowan frowned, closing his book. "How did you know I was here? I didn't make a sound." "Can hear your heart," Caleb said flatly. He took a sip of the scotch. "It's beating at 90 beats a minute, and you smell like a burnt-out electrical socket. The storm?" Rowan crossed his arms defensively. "Yes, I don't like thunder." Caleb didn't offer comfort. He walked over to the sofa and sat down on the far end, leaving a wide expanse of leather between them. He rested his cane against the armrest. The silence stretched, broken only by the heavy rain lashing against the glass. "Why me?" Rowan finally asked. It was the question that had been eating at him since the drawing room. "You could have picked anyone. You could have paid off someone with actual status to play this game. Why pick a broke archivist?" Caleb swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang, testing Rowan's patience. But Rowan didn't fidget. He just waited. "My family," Caleb started, his voice rougher than usual, "is a snake pit. Gideon wants me declared incompetent so he can take control of the board. The Omegas he paraded in front of me were spies. If I bonded with one of them, they would have documented every time I tripped, every time I spilled a glass of water, every time I couldn't read a damn document. They would have built a case for my medical unfitness." Rowan watched the tension in Caleb's jaw. The alpha was proud. Admitting this weakness cost him something. "You needed someone who wasn't in Gideon's pocket," Rowan concluded. "I needed someone who didn't give a damn about the Hayes money," Caleb corrected him. He turned his head toward Rowan. "You dropped a book." I stood up. "Everyone else in that room was terrified of me, but you just told me to move out of your light. You didn't pity me, Rowan. You just found me annoying." "You were standing on my ledgers," Rowan muttered. "Exactly." Caleb took another drink. "You don't treat me like glass." Rowan looked at the man beside him. Stripped of his tailored suits, Caleb just looked tired. The dark glasses were off, revealing eyes that were a cloudy, milky gray. The scars from the accident cut through his eyebrow and down his cheekbone. He looked battered. At that moment, Caleb reached out to set his empty glass on the coffee table. He misjudged the distance. The glass clipped the edge of the wood and fell, shattering on the floor. Caleb froze. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The alpha pride flared, a sudden wave of defensive anger filling the room. He hated making mistakes. He hated the mess. He waited for Rowan to scramble off the couch, to apologize, to clean it up for him like the rest of the staff did. He waited for the inevitable, "Oh, let me get that for you, you poor blind thing." Rowan didn't move. He looked at the shattered glass, then at Caleb. "The broom closet is down the hall to the left," Rowan said calmly. "Third door. The dustpan is on the bottom shelf." Caleb's breath caught. He turned his face slowly toward Rowan. The anger in his scent dissolved, replaced by something entirely different. A profound, crushing relief. Rowan didn't coddle him. Rowan demanded he clean up his own mess. A slow, genuine smile broke across Caleb's face. It changed his entire demeanor, making him look younger, less severe. He stood up, navigating carefully around the broken glass. "Down the hall to the left," Caleb repeated. "Third door," Rowan confirmed, picking his book back up. "Don't step on the shards barefoot. You bleed on the rug. You're cleaning that up too." Caleb chuckled, a real deep sound that resonated in his chest. "Yes, sir." As Caleb walked out of the room to fetch the broom, Rowan looked back at the doorway. His own scent had calmed. The bitter ozone was gone. replaced by the quiet, earthy smell of old paper and settling dust. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the air had shifted. It was still a transaction. It was still a fake marriage born out of necessity and spite. But as Rowan listened to the blind alpha sweeping up shattered glass in the hallway, he realized something dangerous. He didn't hate Caleb Hayes. In fact, he was starting to think this 5-year sentence might not be long enough. The mahogany table in the estate's formal dining room was long enough to seat 20. Today it felt like a chopping block. 7 members of the Hayes Corporation Board of Directors sat in high-backed leather chairs, their faces grim and unreadable. The air in the room was stagnant, heavy with the smell of stale espresso, expensive aftershave, and the quiet, metallic tang of predatory anticipation. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He wore a charcoal suit, his cane resting against his thigh. His posture was impeccable, but his jaw was locked tight enough to crack a molar. Gideon paced near the tall windows. He was enjoying this. The faint, sweet smell of Gideon's satisfaction practically rolled off him in waves. "The issue at hand, gentlemen," Gideon announced, his voice echoing off the paneled walls, "is the stability of leadership. Caleb has successfully fulfilled the terms of the trust by bonding before his 30th birthday. We acknowledge this." A few board members nodded. Harrison, a man whose scent always reminded Caleb of wet cardboard and cigars, cleared his throat. "However, the nature of this bond is highly irregular. A sudden, unannounced marriage to a member of the estate's domestic staff? It projects panic, Caleb. It projects instability to our shareholders." Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "My personal life is not a shareholder concern, Harrison. The stock jumped 3 points this morning. The market appreciates decisive action." "Decisive or desperate?" Gideon countered smoothly. He walked to the table and dropped a thick, leather-bound folder in front of Caleb. The heavy thump of paper on wood was loud in the quiet room. "We brought the quarterly projections for the Asian Logistics Division. There are discrepancies, severe ones. We need your immediate sign-off on the restructuring plan." Caleb's fingers twitched. This was the trap. Gideon knew exactly what he was doing. Caleb relied on digital files, screen readers, and audio briefs prepared by his trusted assistants. Dropping a 100-page physical document in front of him in the middle of a hostile meeting was a calculated move to expose his physical limitation. If Caleb asked someone else to read it, he looked weak. If he deferred the decision, he looked incompetent. "The digital files were sent to your assistant yesterday," Gideon continued, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "But we've made some late-night addendums. Physical copies only for security purposes. I'm sure you can review them. Or perhaps I should handle this division until you are better equipped." The silence in the room stretched. Caleb inhaled slowly. He could smell the fresh ink. He could smell the fear sweating out of his own pores, a bitter scent he ruthlessly suppressed. He was cornered. The heavy oak doors of the dining room clicked open. "Excuse the interruption," a dry, unbothered voice echoed into the tense air. Caleb's head snapped toward the sound. Bruised mint and ozone. "Rowan." Rowan walked into the room carrying a large silver tray laden with fresh coffee carafes, porcelain cups, and glasses of iced water. He wasn't wearing a servant's uniform. He wore a simple tailored navy sweater and dark slacks, looking entirely out of place among the suits, yet carrying himself with a terrifying lack of deference. "What are you doing in here?" Gideon snapped. "Get out. This is a closed executive session." Rowan ignored him. He walked straight to the table, setting the heavy tray down near Harrison. "Your butler's having a panic attack in the kitchen because the caterers brought the wrong brand of sparkling water. I told him I'd bring the coffee before you all dehydrated and died of self-importance." A few board members gasped. Harrison's mouth fell open. Rowan didn't flinch. He began pouring coffee with steady hands. As he moved down the table, he stepped behind Caleb's chair. He didn't touch Caleb, but his presence was a sudden solid wall at Caleb's back. The scent of mint cut through the stale boardroom air, clearing Caleb's mind. Rowan paused, looking down at the open folder in front of Caleb. "We are in the middle of a review," Gideon hissed, taking a step toward Rowan. Leave the room immediately, or I will have security remove you. Fascinating, Rowan muttered, leaning slightly over Caleb's shoulder to stare at the document. He didn't raise his voice, but the utter boredom in his tone commanded the room's attention. Why are you reviewing logistics projections from 3 years ago? The room froze. Caleb's heartbeat hammered against his ribs, but he kept his face completely blank. Explain, Rowan. Page 1, paragraph 2, Rowan said, tapping a finger against the thick parchment. It references the acquisition of the port facility in Busan. The corporation finalized that purchase in late 2023. Furthermore, the watermark on this paper is from the supplier the estate terminated last spring due to cost overruns. Rowan stood up straight, leveling a deadpan stare at Gideon. This isn't a new addendum. This is archival trash. I should know. I spent 3 months cataloging it in the basement. Harrison snatched his own copy of the folder, flipping rapidly to the first page. His face turned an ugly shade of red. He's right. This references the old Busan contract. The trap shattered. Gideon's face went pale, his confident scent instantly turning to the sour stench of panic. There must be a clerical error. The wrong files were printed. A clerical error that you attempted to use to publicly humiliate the CEO, Caleb interjected, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. He didn't need to shout. The authority in his tone pinned Gideon to the floor. You tried to pass off obsolete data to force a restructuring vote under false pretenses. That is boardroom fraud, Gideon. Caleb, be reasonable. Thomas, Caleb said, turning his head slightly toward the senior board member sitting on his right. I want a full audit of Gideon's communications with the printing staff. If he intentionally falsified this meeting's agenda to manipulate a vote, I want him stripped of his board seat by tomorrow morning. Thomas, smelling of nervous sweat and expensive mints, nodded frantically. Yes, Mr. Hayes, immediately. Meeting adjourned, Caleb said. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood as the board members scrambled to pack their things. They couldn't get out of the room fast enough. Gideon shot a look of pure, unadulterated venom at Rowan before storming out, the heavy doors slamming behind him. Within 60 seconds, the vast dining room was empty. Just Caleb, Rowan, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. The tension drained from his shoulders. He reached blindly for the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the leather folder. They were going to vote me out, Caleb said quietly. They were going to try, Rowan corrected, pouring a cup of black coffee and sliding it precisely against Caleb's right hand, exactly where he could find it without fumbling. Your uncle is an idiot. If you're going to forge documents, you don't use estate stationery with out-of-date watermarks. Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm porcelain. He tilted his head up toward Rowan. The Omega's heartbeat was steady. 60 beats a minute, no panic, no gloating, just calm competence. Thank you, Caleb said. The words tasted strange in his mouth. He rarely used them. Don't thank me, Rowan replied, stacking the empty water glasses on his tray. I just hate historical inaccuracies. It offends me on a professional level. Caleb let out a low, rough chuckle. It was the first time he had laughed in weeks. Right. Professional pride. Nothing to do with saving your husband's neck. Rowan paused, the clinking of glasses stopping. The air between them shifted, the scent of bruised mint sweetening just a fraction, losing its bitter edge. 5 years, Caleb. You lose the company, I lose my deal. I'm just protecting my investment. Rowan picked up the tray and walked toward the door. Rowan, Caleb called out before the Omega could cross the threshold. Yes? Your brother's debt. The final wire transfer went through this morning. The hospital is paid in full. The account is closed. Rowan stood completely still. The silver tray rattled slightly in his grip. He didn't turn around. He just stood there for a long moment, staring at the heavy oak doors. Caleb could hear the sudden, chaotic spike in Rowan's heart rate. Understood, Rowan managed to say, his voice tight. He pushed through the doors and was gone. The adrenaline crash hit Rowan somewhere around 2 in the morning. He sat on the floor of his expansive bedroom in the east wing, leaning his back against the base of the massive king-sized bed. A single lamp cast a warm, dim glow over the papers scattered across the Persian rug. They were hospital bills, stacks of them, final notices, collection threats, itemized charges for surgeries that had barely kept his younger brother Toby alive. Across every single page, a massive red stamp read, "Paid in full, zero balance." Rowan stared at the red ink until his vision blurred. For 3 years, this debt had been a physical weight on his chest. It dictated where he lived, what he ate, how many hours he worked until his hands bled. It was a monster that lived in his shadow. Now, with a single signature from a blind billionaire he barely knew, the monster was dead. Toby was safe. Toby could finish his physical therapy without the fear of eviction. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Rowan blinked, wiping a hand roughly over his eyes. He gathered the papers into a messy pile. "Come in." The door swung open silently. Caleb stood in the frame. He was dressed in soft cotton sleep pants and a dark Henley shirt. He held 2 heavy crystal glasses in one hand and a bottle of 20-year-old scotch in the other. His cane swept methodically over the carpet as he navigated into the room. "You're on the floor," Caleb noted, stopping a few feet away. Rowan frowned. "Are you tracking me by sonar now? I can hear you breathing down there. The acoustics in these rooms are terrible," Caleb said, lowering himself carefully onto the edge of the mattress. He set the glasses on the nightstand by touch and poured the amber liquid. "You left the boardroom in a hurry. You didn't come down for dinner." "I wasn't hungry." Rowan pulled his knees to his chest. "I was reviewing the hospital accounts, verifying the zero balances." Caleb extended a hand holding out one of the glasses. Rowan hesitated, then pushed himself up off the floor and took it. Their fingers brushed. Caleb's skin was hot, his knuckles heavily scarred. Rowan sat on the edge of the bed, about 2 feet away from his husband. "It's real," Caleb said quietly. "No strings, Rowan. The debt is gone." "Nothing has no strings," Rowan muttered, taking a sip of the scotch. It burned beautifully going down, a smooth, smoky heat. "You paid a small fortune today. What do you want?" Caleb turned his face toward Rowan. The cloudy gray of his sightless eyes caught the dim light of the bedside lamp. "I want you to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop." Rowan scoffed lightly. "I'm a realist, Caleb. Men like your uncle don't stop just because they lost one battle. They regroup. They find a new angle. And right now, the biggest liability you have is me. You proved today that you are an asset." "In a closed room," Rowan argued, "to a bunch of old men who only care about stock prices. Out there in your world, I'm a nobody. I don't know which fork to use for a salad. I don't know how to smile at people I despise. When the press gets a hold of this, they're going to tear us apart." Caleb leaned back against the headboard. He took a long drink of his scotch. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and heavy. The frantic energy of the day was bleeding out of the room, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. "Tell me about Toby," Caleb said suddenly. Rowan stiffened. He guarded his brother fiercely. He hadn't spoken Toby's name since the day he signed the marriage contract. "Why?" "Because you sacrificed your entire life for him. That tells me more about who you are than any pedigree or trust fund ever could." Caleb set his glass down. "Was it a car crash?" Rowan looked down at the amber liquid in his glass. "A genetic heart defect. Diagnosed when he was 16, he needed a transplant. The insurance fought us every step of the way. By the time he got the heart, the ICU bills alone were enough to bankrupt a small country. My parents passed away when we were kids. It was just me." "So you dropped out of your doctoral program in history to take a job dusting archives," Caleb deduced, piecing together the fragments he had gathered. "It paid cash under the table, and the estate offered a signing bonus," Rowan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I did what I had to do." Caleb shifted closer. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight. He didn't crowd Rowan, but the alpha's heat radiated outward, a comforting, grounding presence. the scent of cedar and expensive soap mixed with Rowan's bruised mint. "I was driving the car," Caleb said. Rowan looked up, surprised by the sudden confession. "When I lost my sight," Caleb continued, staring blankly at the far wall. "I was driving, black ice on a mountain road upstate. I hit a guardrail at 70 miles an hour. The steering column crushed my ribs, and the shattered windshield took my eyes. The doctors said I was lucky to survive." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Lucky? I spent 6 months in total darkness, wishing I'd gone over the cliff. I hated the dark. I hated being helpless." Rowan watched the muscle jump in Caleb's jaw. The billionaire alpha, the man who terrified boardrooms and controlled empires, was exposing the raw, ugly truth of his trauma. He was offering a piece of his own brokenness in exchange for Rowan's. "You aren't helpless," Rowan said firmly. Caleb turned his head toward the sound of Rowan's voice. "Everyone else thinks I am." "Then everyone else is stupid." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. He reached out, his hand hovering in the empty space between them. "Rowan." "Yeah?" "Can I—" Caleb hesitated. The confidence he carried like a shield slipped just a fraction. "Can I touch your face?" "I know the terms of our arrangement. No physical expectations. But I don't know what you look like. I only know your voice and your scent." Rowan's breath caught. He looked at Caleb's outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, searching in the dark. Rowan wasn't a romantic. He didn't believe in soulmates or fated bonds. But sitting here in the quiet of the night, the crushing weight of his brother's debt gone, he felt a strange, terrifying pull toward the man beside him. "Yes," Rowan whispered. He leaned forward, closing the distance. Caleb's fingers brushed against Rowan's jawline. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing size. He traced the line of Rowan's jaw, mapping the bone structure. His thumb brushed over Rowan's cheekbone, feeling the exhaustion lined there. He traced the arch of Rowan's eyebrow, the bridge of his nose, and finally the soft curve of his lower lip. Rowan's eyes fluttered shut. His heart rate, usually so steady, began to betray him, accelerating in a heavy, rhythmic thump. The scent of ozone spiked, turning sweet and heavy in the air. Caleb inhaled sharply. His hand froze against Rowan's cheek. He could read the biological response as clearly as if Rowan had shouted it. "Your heart is racing," Caleb murmured, his voice a low, rough rasp. "I have a lot of caffeine in my system," Rowan lied, his voice trembling slightly. Caleb's thumb stroked his lower lip once more before he pulled his hand back, dropping it to his lap. He didn't push. He didn't cross the boundary. He respected the line they had drawn, even as the tension in the room thickened into something electric and undeniable. "You should sleep," Caleb said softly, picking up his cane. He stood up, towering over the bed. "We have a problem tomorrow." Rowan opened his eyes, the spell breaking. "What problem?" "The Hayes Foundation Gala." Caleb navigated toward the door. "Gideon isn't going to try to beat us in a boardroom again. He's going to do it in public. Get some rest, Rowan. Tomorrow, we go to war." The Hayes Foundation annual charity gala was not a party. It was a battlefield with better lighting and expensive champagne. Held in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel, the event was a mandatory appearance for the city's elite. Hundreds of alphas and omegas moved smoothly across the marble floors, draped in diamonds and designer silk, trading favors, stabbing backs, and smiling the entire time. Rowan stood in the grand foyer, pulling uselessly at the collar of his suit. It was a bespoke Tom Ford creation, midnight blue with subtle black lapels. It fit him perfectly, highlighting a lean, athletic frame he usually hid under baggy sweaters. He looked devastating. He felt like he was wearing a straitjacket. Beside him, Caleb was a towering figure in classic black tie. He held his cane in his right hand. He offered his left arm to Rowan. "You're tugging at your collar," Caleb noted, not turning his head. The roar of the crowd inside the ballroom was a chaotic wall of sound. "It feels like a noose," Rowan muttered. slipping his hand into the crook of Caleb's arm. The thick muscle beneath the tuxedo jacket was rock solid. There are a lot of cameras. Keep your chin up. Don't look at them. Look through them, Caleb instructed, his voice dropping into its boardroom cadence, cool, detached, authoritative. They are sharks, Rowan. If you bleed, they will frenzy. I don't bleed, Rowan said flatly. I know. Caleb's arm tightened slightly against Rowan's hand, a subtle gesture of solidarity. Let's go. They walked through the gilded double doors. The moment they stepped onto the red carpet, the flashbulbs erupted. It was a blinding assault of light. Even though Caleb couldn't see the flashes, the sudden sharp heat of the bulbs and the rapid-fire clicking of the shutters made him grimace slightly. He gripped his cane tighter. Rowan felt the tension radiate from his husband. Instinctively, he stepped slightly ahead, angling his body to shield Caleb from the worst of the press scrum. He projected a calm, icy indifference, pulling Caleb through the chaos with steady, unhurried steps. As they entered the main ballroom, the noise shifted from aggressive shouting to a sophisticated, suffocating hum. The olfactory assault was immediate and overwhelming. To Caleb's heightened senses, the room was a nightmare. Hundreds of synthetic perfumes, chemical pheromone enhancers, and the sharp tang of alpha dominance posturing created a nauseating cocktail. Caleb's breathing grew shallow. He leaned closer to Rowan, burying his nose slightly toward Rowan's shoulder, seeking the clean, grounded scent of bruised mint and ozone. It was the only real thing in the room. They're staring, Rowan murmured, keeping a polite, frozen smile on his face as they navigated the edge of the dance floor. Let them, Caleb replied. They didn't make it 5 minutes before the ambush happened. Caleb! What a fascinating surprise. Rowan stopped. A group of 4 men stood in their path, holding crystal flutes of champagne. In the center was a striking Omega with silver blonde hair and a suit that cost more than Rowan's old apartment. Rowan recognized him immediately from the drawing room on the day he was chosen. Oliver Montgomery's older brother, Felix. Felix was a high society darling. He had a venomous smile and a scent that smelled aggressively of crushed lilies and spite. He looked Rowan up and down, his eyes lingering on the bespoke suit with blatant disdain. Felix, Caleb said, his tone perfectly neutral. I assumed you would be in Europe for the winter. I came back specifically for this, Felix purred, taking a sip of his champagne. His eyes never left Rowan. We were all so shocked to hear of your sudden nuptials. Gideon was devastated. He feels you rushed into things without considering the cultural fit of your new partner. Rowan felt Caleb's arm go rigid. Before the alpha could speak, Felix took a step closer to Rowan. Tell me, Mr. Finch. Oh, apologies. Mr. Hayes, Felix said, dripping with condescension. How are you finding the transition from dusting shelves to high society? It must be terribly overwhelming. I see you're admiring the art. Felix gestured gracefully toward a massive abstract painting hanging on the ballroom wall. It's a Rothko, on loan from the museum, though I suppose to an archivist it just looks like spilled paint, doesn't it? The surrounding guests went quiet, tuning in to the confrontation. This was the blood sport they had come for, the elite closing ranks to publicly humiliate the interloper. Gideon stood a few yards away, watching with a smug, satisfied grin. Caleb's jaw clenched. He prepared to verbally dismantle Felix, but Rowan squeezed his arm, a silent command to hold back. Rowan stepped away from Caleb. He walked slowly toward the painting, clasping his hands behind his back. He studied the canvas for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room stretched. Felix's smug smile widened. A Rothko, Rowan repeated softly. He turned back to Felix, his expression utterly blank. Fascinating. Indeed, Felix sneered. It requires a certain level of education to appreciate. It requires a certain level of education to identify a fraud, Felix, Rowan corrected smoothly. The ballroom gasped. Felix's smile vanished. Excuse me? Rowan walked back, closing the distance until he was standing toe-to-toe with the wealthy Omega. Rowan was taller, and his natural scent flared, pushing back against Felix's chemical lilies with the harsh, crackling energy of an incoming storm. Mark Rothko painted number 14 in 1960, Rowan stated, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silent room. He used a highly specific mixture of animal glue and synthetic resins to bind his pigments. The canvas you are looking at has severe microfractures in the upper left quadrant, indicative of a modern acrylic binder drying too quickly under artificial heat. Rowan tilted his head, his eyes cold. Furthermore, the museum never loans out the original for private galas due to light sensitivity. This is a licensed reproduction painted by a graduate student in 2008. It's worth about $400. You're currently drinking a glass of champagne that costs more than that painting. Someone in the crowd let out a sharp bark of laughter. Felix flushed a violent, ugly shade of red. He opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He had simply repeated a talking point he thought sounded sophisticated. Rowan had mathematically dismantled him in front of the city's most powerful people. "If you're going to try and humiliate me using art history, Felix," Rowan advised softly, "I highly recommend you don't pick a fight with the man who actually reads the provenance files." Rowan turned his back on Felix, dismissing him entirely. He walked back to Caleb and slipped his hand smoothly back into the crook of the Alpha's arm. "Shall we find our table, darling?" Rowan asked, his voice perfectly sweet. Caleb's chest rumbled with a deep, vibrating chuckle that he didn't even try to hide. The sound sent a shockwave through the crowd. Caleb Hayes never laughed in public. Never. "Lead the way," Caleb rumbled, a fierce protective pride swelling in his chest. As they walked away, leaving Felix sputtering in humiliation, the whispers in the room changed. The pity was gone. The contempt was gone. They looked at Rowan not as a victim, not as a charity case, but as a predator perfectly adapted to survive in their world. Caleb leaned his head down, speaking directly into Rowan's ear over the swelling noise of the room. "You," Caleb whispered, his voice dark and thrilled, "are absolutely terrifying." Rowan looked up at his husband. The cynical shield he carried finally cracked, giving way to a genuine, breathtaking smile. "I told you," Rowan whispered back, leaning into the warmth of Caleb's body. "I don't bleed." The ride back to the Hayes estate was swallowed by silence. The Bentley's heavy doors isolated them from the roar of the city, leaving only the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of rain against the tinted glass. Rowan slouched in the leather seat. The adrenaline that had carried him through the gala was evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He loosened his tie and unfastened the top two buttons of his shirt. He let his head rest against the cool window. Caleb sat rigid beside him. He hadn't spoken since they left the hotel. He was listening. The Alpha's senses were dialed up to a razor-sharp edge, processing the lingering scent of Rowan's defensive ozone. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb finally said. The low baritone of his voice vibrated in the quiet cabin. Rowan didn't open his eyes. "Do what? Point out a fake painting?" "Step in front of me." Rowan turned his head, looking at the sharp profile of his husband. Caleb was staring straight ahead into the darkness he permanently inhabited. "Felix was aiming for me, not you," Rowan replied softly. "He wanted to prove I didn't belong. He succeeded. I don't belong there, Caleb, but I'm not going to let a spoiled brat with a trust fund insult my intelligence." He was trying to humiliate me by proxy, to prove Gideon's point that I'm unfit to lead because I chose poorly. Caleb turned his face toward Rowan. The cloudy gray eyes caught the passing glow of the streetlights. "You proved him completely wrong." Rowan swallowed hard. The raw honesty in Caleb's voice was heavier than the hostility at the gala. "I told you. I'm protecting my investment." Caleb's lips twitched. "Right. The investment." The Bentley slowed, taking the long, winding turn into the private drive of the estate. The tires crunched over the gravel. But as they approached the main house, the heavy iron gates were already open. Rowan sat up straight. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. "The gates are open," Rowan said. Caleb frowned. "The automated system locks them at 10. "They're open," Rowan repeated. The car rolled to a stop at the front portico. Rowan looked at the massive, sprawling facade of the Hayes estate. It was completely pitch black. No porch lights. No warm glow from the drawing room windows. Nothing. It looked like a tomb against the stormy night sky. "The power is out," Rowan said, his hand resting on the door handle. "The estate has 3 separate commercial-grade backup generators," Caleb replied, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. He reached for his cane. "They engage automatically within 4 seconds of a grid failure. If the house is dark, it's intentional." The driver, a private security contractor, turned around. "Mr. Hayes, I strongly advise we stay in the vehicle. I will call local law enforcement." Before the driver could reach for the radio, the front doors of the estate swung open. A harsh, blinding beam from a tactical flashlight cut through the rain, sweeping across the hood of the Bentley. Rowan's heart hammered against his ribs. He could smell it before he even saw the figures emerging from the dark. Sour sweat, stale cigar smoke, and the arrogant, overwhelming stench of a synthetic cedar cologne. "Gideon." "Stay in the car," Caleb commanded. He pushed his door open and stepped out into the freezing rain. Rowan didn't listen. He was out of his door a second later, rounding the trunk to stand shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. The rain instantly soaked through his expensive suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. Gideon stood on the top step of the portico. He was flanked by 3 massive men wearing unmarked tactical gear. One of them held the flashlight, keeping the beam trained directly on Caleb's face. "Welcome home, Caleb," Gideon said. His voice was entirely too calm. Caleb didn't flinch at the light. He planted his cane on the wet stone. "You shut down the grid. You dismissed the staff. You're trespassing on my property, Gideon." "I am securing the property," Gideon corrected smoothly. He pulled a thick folded document from his coat pocket. "I spent the evening with a very accommodating Superior Court judge. He was highly concerned by the medical reports I provided regarding your mental state, specifically the paranoia and erratic behavior culminating in a sudden, unvetted marriage to a desperate domestic worker." Rowan's fists clenched. "You bought a judge." "I secured a temporary medical conservatorship," Gideon snapped, ignoring Rowan entirely. "You are not of sound mind, Caleb. The board saw it yesterday. The judge saw it tonight. You need treatment. These gentlemen are here to escort you to a private psychiatric facility in upstate New York until a full evaluation can be completed." Caleb laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound that cut right through the noise of the storm. "You think you can drag me out of my own home in the middle of the night?" "I don't think it," Gideon said, stepping back. He nodded to the 3 mercenaries. "I know it." The men moved down the steps. They were big, heavily muscled alphas, their scents flaring aggressively in the damp air. They expected a struggle, but they expected a blind, helpless man. They didn't realize they had just stepped into Caleb's world. "Rowan," Caleb said. His voice was a low, vibrating hum, barely audible over the rain. 3 o'clock. Move." Rowan didn't ask questions. He bolted to the right, diving behind one of the massive stone pillars that supported the portico. The man with the flashlight lunged forward, reaching for Caleb's arm. Caleb didn't step back. He stepped in. He tracked the man by the heavy, sloshing sound of his combat boots and the reek of cheap adrenaline. As the mercenary grabbed his shoulder, Caleb dropped his cane. His right hand snapped up, locking onto the man's wrist. With a brutal, twisting motion, Caleb pivoted his hips and threw his entire weight forward. The alpha's strength, untethered by the need to maintain boardroom decorum, was devastating. The mercenary let out a sharp yell as his arm snapped. He crashed onto the wet stone, the flashlight spinning out of his hand and shattering against a pillar. The portico plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. "Grab him!" Gideon shrieked from the top of the stairs, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "He's blind! Just grab him!" But the remaining two mercenaries had lost their visual advantage. The rain masking their scent and the sudden darkness left them disoriented. They hesitated, their boots scraping nervously against the wet stone. Caleb didn't hesitate. He lived in the dark. He knew the exact dimensions of the portico. He knew the distance from the stairs to the driveway. He knew exactly where the men were standing by the ragged, panicked sound of their breathing. He moved like a ghost, no cane, no hesitation. The second man took a wild swing in the dark. Caleb ducked under it, feeling the displacement of the air. He drove his elbow straight into the center of the man's chest. The sickening crunch of cartilage echoed over the storm. The mercenary collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Where is he?" the third man yelled, spinning wildly. Rowan, pressed flat against the stone pillar, could see nothing, but he could hear. He picked up a piece of the shattered flashlight casing from the ground. He threw it hard against the heavy oak doors behind the third mercenary. The plastic clattered against the wood. The mercenary whipped around toward the sound. Caleb moved instantly. He swept the man's legs out from under him with a brutal kick to the back of the knee. As the man went down, Caleb grabbed the back of his tactical vest and slammed him face first into the stone steps. Silence fell over the portico. The only sounds were the heavy rain and the groans of the three men bleeding on the ground. "Gideon!" Caleb called out. His voice was perfectly level, unbothered, completely devoid of exertion. A pathetic, terrified whimpering came from the top of the stairs. Gideon was huddled against the oak doors, his hands raised to protect his face. He smelled like pure, distilled terror. Rowan stepped out from behind the pillar. The clouds shifted slightly, allowing a faint sliver of moonlight to cut through the storm. He saw Caleb standing in the center of the steps. The Alpha wasn't a victim. He wasn't a liability. He was a king standing over a conquered battlefield. Rowan walked up the steps. He didn't look at the mercenaries. He walked straight past Caleb, up to the heavy oak doors, and grabbed Gideon by the collar of his expensive coat. Rowan dragged the whimpering man down 2 steps and threw him at Caleb's feet. "Your brother's hospital debt wasn't the only file I reviewed," Rowan said, looking down at Gideon with absolute disgust. "I spent the afternoon going through the personal accounts of the board members. I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans. I know you've been skimming off the logistics division for 6 years. Gideon gasped, staring up at Rowan in horror. "The police are already on their way," Rowan continued calmly. "The driver called them the second you stepped out the door. You have a choice, Gideon. You can stay here, get arrested for assault and trespassing, and let me hand those financial records over to the feds. Or you can get in your car, drive to the airport, and never set foot in this city again." Sirens wailed in the distance, a faint sound cutting through the storm. Gideon scrambled to his feet. He didn't say a word. He didn't look back. He ran to his parked car, the tires squealing violently as he tore down the driveway, abandoning his hired muscle. Rowan stood on the steps, breathing heavily. The cold rain soaked through to his skin, shivering violently now that the adrenaline was crashing for a second time. Caleb walked up the steps slowly. He stopped exactly 1 foot away from Rowan. "You went through his financials," Caleb said. "I told you," Rowan whispered, his teeth chattering slightly. "I hate historical inaccuracies. The math didn't add up." Caleb reached out in the dark. His large hands found Rowan's shoulders, pulling the Omega forward. Rowan didn't resist. He collapsed against Caleb's chest, burying his face into the wet fabric of Caleb's tuxedo jacket. Caleb wrapped his arms around Rowan, holding him tight. The Alpha's heat soaked into Rowan's freezing skin. For the first time since the accident, Caleb felt entirely whole. He couldn't see the man in his arms, but he knew exactly who he was. He knew his strength, his sharp mind, and his unyielding loyalty. "You're freezing," Caleb murmured, pressing his face into Rowan's wet hair, breathing in the scent of rain and bruised mint. "The power's still out," Rowan pointed out, his voice muffled against Caleb's chest. "We don't need the lights," Caleb said softly. He tilted Rowan's chin up. In the pitch-black darkness, guided only by the sound of Rowan's racing heartbeat, Caleb found his lips. The kiss wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a deal. It was a violent, desperate collision of two men who had spent their entire lives fighting alone, finally realizing they had found their equal. Rowan grabbed the lapels of Caleb's jacket, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, possessive heat. The bitter ozone in the air sweetened entirely, settling into a deep, rich scent of earth and home. The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet gravel. But on the dark steps of the estate, neither of them pulled away. Gideon's desperate play for power ended in ruin, proving that a true alpha isn't defined by his physical sight, but by the undeniable strength of his will. Caleb and Rowan started as a cynical business transaction, but when the darkness closed in, they found the ultimate light in each other. Their bond shattered the expectations of high society and built an empire built on trust and equality. If this gritty, grounded Omegaverse drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense BL stories.